The Digital Forge, the main development floor at Gravity Spike Games, operates on a very specific TA and a very delicate ecosystem of controlled chaos. It's a sprawling, open-plan wonderland of a workspace in Seattle, a place that smells, at any given moment, of lukewarm coffee, the ozone hum of 1,000 overworked computer fans, and the faint, sugary scent of stale donuts. The currency of our realm is not the dollar. 'Tis the brilliant idea. And the uniform of our order is not the suit and tie. It is the humble and the deeply, deeply comfortable hoodie. I am Dr. Evelyn Reed. I am 68 years old. And for the past 25 years, my office has been a corner desk with a triple monitor setup, a ridiculously ergonomic chair, and a view of the Space Needle. I am the senior systems architect for what is, I say with no false modesty, one of the most successful video game studios on the planet. I am, in the affectionate and deeply respectful parlance of my younger colleagues, the company's graybeard. I am the Oracle, the final boss, the one they come to when a bug is so deep, so monstrous, so utterly system-breaking that they have lost all hope. And my thinking cap, the one I have worn to solve every single one of those impossible problems, is a faded, well-worn, and deeply beloved gray hoodie with the letters MIT printed on the front. Our studio is a place of beautiful and of a highly productive anarchy. We have Nerf gun wars to solve creative disputes. We have a life-size statue of our most famous video game character, Sir Reginald the Brave, in the lobby. We have a company-wide Dungeons & Dragons campaign that has been running continuously. For the past 7 years, we are a collection of brilliant, passionate, and deeply, deeply nerdy artisans. We are not a corporation. We are a guild. And we have, for 25 years, built a legacy of award-winning, critically acclaimed, and ridiculously profitable video games on a simple and a profoundly effective principle. Hire the most brilliant people you can find, and then get the hell out of their way and let them create this beautiful, chaotic, and deeply, deeply successful ecosystem was, however, about to be invaded by an alien species. A creature from a world of sterile boardrooms, of meaningless buzzwords, and of a profound and a deeply, deeply ignorant belief that a company's culture can be optimized on a spreadsheet. A creature known in its native habitat as the HR manager. The graybeard I was there at the beginning. In 1999, Gravity Spike Games was not a multi-million-dollar corporation with a fancy office in Seattle. It was 3 kids in a damp, chilly garage in Bellevue, with a single sputtering server, a mountain of student loan debt, and a brilliant and a completely insane idea for a new kind of video game. I was one of those kids. Well, I was a 30-something postdoc who had just finished her PhD in computer science at MIT. But in spirit, I was a kid. The other 2 were the company's founders, a brilliant, chaotic coder named Sam, and a visionary, and a deeply, deeply impractical artist named Leo. They had the idea. I was the one who knew how to actually build the engine that would make it work. The 3 of us, fueled by cheap pizza and a shared and a deeply, deeply nerdy dream, had built our first game in that garage. It had been a massive and a completely unexpected hit, and so the company had grown. But we had made a pact. In those early, hungry days, we would never become corporate. We would never have pointless meetings. We would never, ever have a dress code. The only thing that mattered was the quality of the work, the quality of the game. Our success was a testament to that simple and that powerful idea. Sam, our CEO, was still a brilliant, chaotic coder at heart. He still wore ripped jeans and heavy metal T-shirts to our board meetings. My own role in the company had evolved over the years. I was no longer a simple coder. I was the architect. I was the one who designed the deep underlying systems upon which our massive, complex, and beautiful game worlds were built. I was the keeper of the company's core, technical soul, and my hoodie. My collection of hoodies. They were more than just a piece of clothing. They were my uniform. It's my armor. They were a symbol of the culture we had built. A culture that valued comfort and focus and the quiet, introspective, and deeply, deeply productive state of a programmer who is completely and totally in the zone. To put on my hoodie was to put on my thinking cap. It was a signal to myself and to the world that I was about to go to war with a piece of very, very difficult code. And it was a war I always eventually won. The new variable, the announcement, came at our quarterly all-hands meeting. Our CEO stood before the entire company, looking, as he always did, slightly uncomfortable to be the center of attention. "Hey everyone," he'd begun. "So, we're growing fast, which is great, but it means we have to do some grown-up stuff." A low, good-natured groan had rippled through the room of 200 assembled nerds. I know, he'd said with a grin. "But the board is insisting. We are now a company of a certain size, and we need to have the proper, quote-unquote, human resources infrastructure. So, we've hired a new HR manager." And then he had introduced him. His name was Chadwick. And he was, without a doubt, the most alien life form I had ever seen inside the walls of our studio. He was 25 years old, with a brand new MBA from a school I had never heard of. He was wearing a crisp, tailored, and deeply, deeply out-of-place business suit with a tie so tight it looked like it was actively trying to strangle him. His hair was a perfect shellacked and an entirely unmoving helmet. He had the soft, uncalloused hands of a man who had never had to build a single tangible thing in his entire life. And his face was a mask of a bright, eager, and a deeply, deeply soulless corporate enthusiasm. He had taken the stage and had delivered a short and a deeply, deeply cringeworthy speech. It was a masterpiece of meaningless corporate jargon. He had talked about synergizing our core values and optimizing our human capital and implementing a new paradigm of proactive, strategic engagement. It was like listening to a foreign language, a language in which words were used not to convey meaning, but to obscure it. The veteran developers around me were staring at him with a look of profound and of a deeply, deeply amused horror. He was a parody, a walking, talking, and a deeply, deeply unfortunate cartoon of a corporate drone. His first, official act as our new HR manager was to try and eliminate our flexible work hours. He had sent out a company-wide memo announcing that, effective immediately, all employees would be required to be at their desks from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Sharp, the rebellion had been a quiet and a deeply, deeply effective one. The senior developers, myself included, had requested a meeting with him. We had sat in his new, sterile office, and we had, with a calm and a deeply, deeply logical patience, explained to him the fundamental nature of creative work. We had explained that a programmer's mind is not a factory machine that can be turned on and off at will. We had explained that our best work, our most brilliant, and our most profitable ideas often happened at 3 o'clock in the morning after a long and a deeply, deeply unproductive afternoon of staring at a wall. He had tried to argue. Of course, he had talked about accountability and metrics. We had, in turn, simply showed him the sales numbers for our last and our most successful game. A game that had been built almost entirely by a team of people working on a schedule that was as chaotic, as flexible, and as deeply, deeply eccentric. As they were, he had been forced to retreat. He had sent out a second and a deeply, deeply humiliated memo explaining that the new 925 policy was now just a strong suggestion. He had lost his first great battle. And I and all the other old guard developers had made a new and a deeply, deeply powerful enemy. Chadwick had been publicly outmaneuvered, and his small and his deeply, deeply insecure MBA-addled brain was now, I was quite sure, focused on a new and a much more personal form of revenge. He could not control our hours, but he was about to try and control our bodies. I saw him, in the weeks that followed, walking through the studio, his ever-present tablet in his hand. He was not talking to people, he was observing them. He was a corporate anthropologist studying our strange and our deeply, deeply successful native culture. And he was, I knew, taking notes. He was documenting our ripped jeans, our heavy metal t-shirts, our bare feet. Kendi was, with a particular and a deeply, deeply ominous focus. Looking at the sea of comfortable and of deeply, deeply non-corporate hoodies that were the unofficial uniform of his new and his deeply, deeply unruly kingdom. The dread in the office was a palpable thing. We all knew that a new and a much stupider edict was coming. We just didn't know how stupid it was going to be. The memo arrived on a Tuesday morning, not with a bang, but with the quiet, unassuming ping of a company-wide email. It was from Chadwick, our new and deeply unloved HR manager. The subject line, in a bold and a deeply ominous font, was Mandatory New Professional Attire and Grooming Policy, effective immediately. A collective and a deeply theatrical groan rippled through the development floor. I was in the middle of a complex and a deeply frustrating debugging session for the new physics engine of our upcoming game, Starfall Odyssey. My mind was a tangled web of C++ and quaternion mathematics. I ignored the email. I had real and deeply, deeply important work to do. But the digital chatter on our company's Slack channels was impossible to ignore. The main developers channel, which was usually a quiet stream of code snippets and technical questions, had exploded into a chaotic and a deeply, deeply sarcastic festival of mockery. Tim_the_enchanter, lead animator, oh goody. A new set of rules from the fun police. Sandra_the_sorceress-led world builder. Does this mean I have to start wearing shoes at my desk? 'Cause that feels like a hostile work environment. Me, Dr_Evie_the_graybeard. Can someone just give me the executive summary? I'm in the middle of the gravity well bug. A junior coder, a kid named Leo, posted a screenshot of the policy's main infraction table. It was a thing of pure, unadulterated, and deeply, deeply idiotic corporate madness. Prohibited attire includes, but is not limited to, T-shirts with graphical, political, or humorous slogans, jeans with any visible rips, tears or phrase designer or otherwise, open-toed footwear of any kind, including but not limited to sandals, flip-flops, and Crocs, hats or any other form of non-religious head covering, and the final glorious and deeply, deeply personal bullet point, hooded sweatshirts henceforth referred to as hoodies. I stared at the screenshot. My hoodie. My beloved, faded, and deeply, deeply comfortable MIT hoodie. The very garment that was, at that moment, serving as my armor. My comfort blanket and my thinking cap had just been declared illegal. This was no longer a matter of corporate foolishness. This was a declaration of war. The meeting Chadwick, in his infinite and his deeply, deeply misguided wisdom, had decided to call a mandatory all-hands meeting to discuss the new policy and field any questions. The meeting was held in our largest conference room, a space we usually used for celebrating game launches with pizza and champagne. Today, it was a courtroom, and we, the entire 200-person staff of creatively dressed and deeply, deeply nerdy game developers, were the silent and the deeply, deeply resentful jury. Chadwick stood at the front of the room next to a large screen. He was, of course, wearing a perfectly tailored and a deeply, deeply soulless gray suit. He looked like a tax auditor who had accidentally stumbled into a Hobbit convention. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice a reedy and a deeply, deeply unconfident thing that was a poor match for the authority he was trying to project. I know that change can be challenging. But as Gravity Spike Games continues to grow and mature as a company, it is essential that we embrace a more professional and a more client-facing public image. He clicked a button. First slide of his PowerPoint presentation appeared on the screen. It was a stock photograph of a group of attractive, multi-ethnic, and deeply, deeply fake-looking business people, all laughing and shaking hands in a generic, glass-walled office. Underneath the photo, in a large and a deeply, deeply offensive font, were the words, "Dress for Success." For the next 20 minutes, he walked us through his presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate nonsense, symphony of meaningless buzzwords and bad clip art. He talked about brand synergy, from fostering a culture of excellence and aligning our external presentation with our internal ambition. He was not speaking to us. He was performing a bizarre one-man play that he had learned in some terrible and a deeply, deeply useless MBA program. And then he made his fatal mistake. He opened the floor to questions. A long and a deeply, deeply hostile silence filled the room. And then a hand went up. It was from a man named Marcus, our lead systems engineer, a brilliant and a deeply, deeply sarcastic man who had been with the company for 15 years. "Yeah, Stadwick," Marcus began, his voice a low, dangerous drawl. "I have a question about the footwear policy. It states that all footwear must be of a closed-toe design. Does that, in your professional opinion, include chainmail sabatons?" A few suppressed snickers rippled through the room. Chadwick just stared at him, his face a mask of blank, uncomprehending confusion. "What?" "Chainmail sabatons," Marcus repeated, his voice perfectly straight. "Ah, it's a form of medieval armored footwear. They are technically of a closed-toe design." "That's not professional," Chadwick finally stammered. "But is it in the policy?" another developer called out. The questions began to come in a flood, a beautiful, logical, and a deeply, deeply pedantic assault from a room full of professional problem solvers who had just been presented with a flawed and a deeply, deeply stupid piece of code. They began to pick it apart, line by logical line. "The policy bans graphic T-shirts. Could you please provide a specific and a legally binding definition of the term graphic? If I am wearing a shirt with a solid red square on it, is that a graphic, or is it a geometric shape? The policy bans ripped jeans. What is the acceptable quantitative metric for a rip? Is it a function of length, of surface area? Does a single broken thread constitute a rip?" Was a massacre, a quiet, polite, and a deeply, deeply nerdy massacre. Chadwick was completely and totally out of his depth. He had come with a set of vague and of deeply, deeply arbitrary rules. And he was being confronted by a room full of people whose entire lives were dedicated to the beautiful and the unforgiving logic of a closed system. Underscore the unspoken target, finally. I decided it was time to enter the fray. I raised my hand. "Yes, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice now a tight and a deeply, deeply stressed thing. He knew I was the final boss. "Chadwick," I began, my voice a calm and a quiet and a deeply, deeply reasonable thing. "I, too, have a question about the logic of the policy. I would like to focus on the specific prohibition of hooded sweatshirts. Could you please explain to me the specific functional and material difference between the non-technical cotton blend fabric of an MIT sweatshirt, which is banned, and the non-technical cotton blend fabric of a Harvard crewneck sweater, which, according to your own policy, would be perfectly acceptable?" He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Is it the hood itself that you have deemed unprofessional?" I continued, my voice still a gentle and a deeply, deeply curious thing. "Is it your professional opinion that the presence of a small, decorative, and entirely limp piece of fabric on the back of a garment is the primary barrier between our company, and a new paradigm of corporate excellence. The room was now a sea of suppressed and of deeply, deeply joyful laughter. A hoodie is just not professional, Dr. Reed, he finally managed to say. His face now a bright and a deeply, deeply satisfying shade of crimson. But why? I pressed, my voice still a mask of pure academic inquiry. What is the specific and the quantifiable metric you are using to define professionalism? Because I, a woman who has personally written over 2 million lines of the core, foundational code upon which this entire multi-million-dollar company is built, have done so almost exclusively while wearing a hooded sweatshirt. I must ask you, Chadwick, is it the code that is unprofessional? Or is it just my clothes? And that was it. It's the final and the most beautiful checkmate. He had no answer. He had no logic. He had no reason. He had only his own, small, and his deeply, deeply insecure, and his deeply, deeply arbitrary sense of authority, the policy. He finally said, his voice a low and a deeply, deeply defeated hiss, is the policy. It is not up for debate, and it will be enforced, effective immediately. The meeting was over. He had lost the argument, but he had, for the moment, won the war. He had fallen back on the one, single, and the most pathetic defense of a weak, and an incompetent leader because I said so. I walked back to my desk. The amused and the deeply, deeply rebellious murmurs of my colleagues echoing around me. The joy of our small intellectual victory was quickly fading, replaced by the cold and the hard and the deeply, deeply infuriating reality of the situation. The stupid and the pointless and the deeply, deeply illogical rule was now in effect. I sat at my desk. I looked at the new laminated copy of the dress code that had been placed on my keyboard while I was in the meeting, and my eyes were drawn as if by a magnet to a single and a deeply, deeply interesting sentence. A sentence I had not noticed before. It was the sentence that described what was allowed. Business casual or formal business attire, it read, is acceptable. And as I looked at those 4 beautiful and deeply, deeply vague words, I felt a slow and a mischievous and a deeply, deeply satisfying smile begin to spread across my face. He thought he had ended the debate, but he had, in his haste, and in his profound and his deeply, deeply wonderful stupidity, just given me the perfect and the most glorious loophole. The war was not over, was just about to enter a new and a far, far more interesting phase. Deconstructing the code, I went home from that meeting with a copy of Chadwick's Ridiculous and his deeply, deeply flawed dress code policy clutched in my hand. My colleagues were seething. They spent the rest of the afternoon grumbling at their desks, firing off angry, sarcastic messages on our private Slack channels. They were reacting with emotion, with righteous and with entirely justified indignation. But I, a woman who has spent her entire life finding a quiet and a deep and a profound joy in the cold, hard, and unforgiving logic of a well-ordered system, I did not get angry. I got analytical. That evening, I sat at my dining room table. I did not have a glass of wine. I had a cup of black coffee, a yellow legal pad, and 3 different colored pens. I was not a disgruntled employee. I was a systems architect, and I was about to perform a full and a deeply, deeply thorough code review on a very, very buggy piece of software. The document itself was a masterpiece of corporate incompetence. It was a classic example of a system designed by a person who did not understand the end user, the operating environment, or the fundamental principles of logic itself. It was full of undefined variables, of contradictory statements, and of beautiful, glorious, and deeply, deeply exploitable loopholes. I made a list of its structural flaws. Flaw number 1, negative rather than positive definition. The policy was a long and a deeply specific list of what was banned, hoodies, graphic tees, open-toed shoes. But it was incredibly and almost comically vague on what was allowed. It contained only one single beautiful sentence on the subject. Business casual or formal business attire is acceptable. It did not define those terms. It did not provide examples. This was not a guideline. It was a gaping and a deeply, deeply inviting, void of legal interpretation. Flaw number 2, lack of a spirit of the law clause. A well-written corporate policy, as I knew from my years of occasionally having to read them, always includes a catch-all phrase, something like, all attire should be in keeping with a professional and productive work environment. This allows a company to shut down any ridiculous, malicious compliance attempts. Chadwick, in his arrogant and his deeply, deeply foolish haste, had not included such a clause. He had given us the letter of the law, but not the spirit. A fatal and a deeply, deeply amateur mistake. Flaw number 3, the assumption of a shared context. The policy was written with the unstated assumption that we all shared his deeply, deeply boring and his deeply, deeply conventional definition of the word professional. He thought he was writing a clear and a simple set of rules, but he was writing for a room full of 200 of the most creative, the most pedantic, and the most deeply, deeply nerdy role testers on the planet. He had just handed a new and a very, very interesting toy to a room full of professional hackers. I sat there, looking at the structural weaknesses of his pathetic little policy, and I felt the familiar and the deeply satisfying thrill of a programmer who has just found a critical and a system-breaking exploit. The question was not if I could break his new rules. The question was how I could do so in the most elegant, the most spectacular, and the most deeply, deeply humiliating way possible. Underscore the arsenals of inspiration. When it came, was not from a place of anger. It came from a place of love. It was Saturday, and I was on my weekly video call with my son Michael. He was not a programmer. He was a history professor at the University of Washington, a man whose passions were the messy and the deeply, deeply analog worlds of the past. His specific area of expertise was late medieval and early Renaissance European warfare. His house, to the eternal and the deeply patient amusement of his wife, was a museum of historical replicas. I was, of course, venting to him about the ridiculous new state of affairs at my office. It's the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of it all. Michael, I had ranted, pacing back and forth in my living room with my laptop. He's banned my favorite hoodie, my thinking cap. And for what? For professionalism. What does that even mean? Well, Mom, he'd said, a familiar, mischievous twinkle in his eye. You know, if you're looking for formal business attire, I do have that new suit you could borrow. I had stopped pacing. What new suit? The suit, he'd said, his grin widening. It's the one I had custom made by that armorer in the Czech Republic. The 15th century Gothic plate harness. It is, by the standards of the professional, warrior-adjacent businessman of the 1480s, the absolute height of formal, and of deeply, deeply intimidating business attire. He was, of course, joking, but a woman who had just spent a week deconstructing the logical flaws in a poorly written corporate edict, was not. A slow and a deeply, deeply beautiful, and a wonderfully, wonderfully unhinged idea began to form in my mind. A suit of armor. It was not a hoodie. It was not a t-shirt. It was not in any way, shape, or form on Chadwick's pathetic little list of banned items. And it was, by any historical and by any deeply, deeply pedantic definition of the term, formal attire. It was the perfect, and the most glorious, and the most deeply, deeply logical act of malicious compliance I could have ever possibly imagined. Michael, I said, my voice a low and a deeply, deeply serious thing. Tell me more about this suit. I drove to my son's house the next morning. Its garage, which should have housed a sensible Subaru Outback, was, in fact, a medieval armory. And there, standing in the center of the room on a custom-made mannequin, was my weapon. It was a thing of breathtaking and of a deeply, deeply nerdy beauty. It was not a cheap fantasy costume. It was a perfect museum quality and a fully articulated replica of a 15th century German Gothic suit of plate armor. It was 60 pounds of polished, fluted, and deeply, deeply beautiful 18-gauge steel. "Isn't she a beauty?" Michael had said, his voice full of a historian's pride. "She is magnificent," I'd breathed. "Now, show me how to put it on." The next hour was a comical and a deeply, deeply informative lesson in the art of medieval warfare. He showed me the pieces, one by one. The greaves that protected the lower legs, the cuirass that protected the chest and back, the gauntlets that protected the hands, and finally the sallet helmet, with its elegant sweeping tail and its intimidating slit-like visor. He helped me suit up. It was a slow and a deeply, deeply cumbersome process. But when the final piece, the helmet, was in place, I looked at my reflection in the garage mirror. I did not see a 60-year-old software architect. I saw a warrior, small and a slightly ridiculous, and a deeply, deeply determined warrior. Joan of Arc, but with a PhD in computer science and a profound and a deeply, deeply held grudge against the human resources. Department ______, the logistics of Wari brought the suit home in the back of my car, and I spent the rest of my Sunday engaged in the final and the most crucial phase of my plan, the feasibility study. It was not enough for the armor to be legally compliant. It also had to be in some small and in some deeply, deeply absurd way functional. I had a job to do after all. The first and the most important question, can I code in it? I sat down at my desk, the metal plates of the armor groaning in protest. The ergonomic chair, designed for the soft, fleshy bodies of modern office workers, was not a good fit, but I managed. Then came the gauntlets. The thick leather and steel-plated gloves made my fingers feel like a bunch of clumsy metal sausages. Typing was impossible. This was a problem, but I was a problem solver. I went to my workshop, a place filled with the detritus of a lifetime of electronic hobbies, and I found my solution. I took an old stylus pen and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. And I, with a great deal of effort, taped the stylus to the tip of the right-hand gauntlet's index finger. It was a ridiculous and a deeply, deeply ugly hack, okay? A piece of medieval technology, jury-rigged with a piece of modern digital technology. It was a perfect and a deeply, deeply nerdy metaphor for my entire life, and it worked. I could, with a slow and a deeply, deeply deliberate pecking motion, now operate my keyboard and my mouse. The second and the equally important question, can I drink coffee in it? I brewed a pot. I discovered that, with the visor of the salad helmet lifted and by using a very long and a very flexible reusable straw, I could, in fact, sip my coffee. It was not an elegant process. Oh, it was a possible one. I let the words hang in the air. Entire office was now a silent and a deeply, deeply rapt audience to this beautiful and this deeply, deeply satisfying public execution. Chadwick just stood there, his face a beautiful and a deeply, deeply satisfying shade of crimson. He was a man who had been so completely, so totally, and so beautifully outmaneuvered that he had no moves left to make. He had been checkmated by a 68-year-old woman in a suit of armor, using the rules of a game that he himself had invented. He just made a strange and a deeply, deeply pathetic squeaking sound. And then he turned and he fled, his two terrified assistants scurrying in his wake. I watched him go. And then I slowly and with a great and a deeply, deeply satisfying metallic sigh lowered my visor. I turned back to my screen, and with a slow and a deliberate and a deeply, deeply triumphant peck of my stylus-equipped finger, I deleted a semicolon. I had a bug to fix. And my work on all fronts was finally and completely done. The legend, the immediate aftermath of my confrontation with Chadwick was not a loud and a triumphant celebration. It was a deep and a profoundly and a wonderfully productive silence. Chadwick, his face the color of a freshly boiled beet, had scurried back to his glass-walled office, had closed the door, and had not been seen again for the rest of the day. The rest of us, the developers, the artists, the writers, the creators of worlds, we just went back to work. But the atmosphere in the studio had been fundamentally and irrevocably changed. The low-grade, oppressive fog of his pointless corporate bureaucracy had been burned away by the pure and the deeply, deeply absurd light of a 68-year-old woman in a full suit of armor. The joy was back. Its creative, chaotic, and deeply, deeply productive energy of our studio had been restored. The story, of course, went viral. First, it was an internal and a deeply, deeply hilarious firestorm on our company's Slack channels. A new private channel was created called #Sevelin and Vinatable. It was immediately filled with a glorious and a deeply, deeply nerdy flood of memes. There were photoshops of my helmeted face onto the cover of our most famous fantasy game. There were animated GIFs of knights typing at keyboards. I had not just proven a point. I had become a legend. By the end of the day, the story had, as all good stories do, leaked to the outside world. A junior artist who was friends with a writer at a major online gaming publication had shared the tale. The next morning, the headline on the industry's most read website was a thing of pure and of a deeply, deeply beautiful poetry. *** sources. New HR manager at Gravity Spike Games bans hoodies. Legendary graybeard programmer reportedly shows up in full plate armor. The story was everywhere. It was the talk of the entire global video game industry. Chadwick had not just been defeated. He had been transformed in the space of 24 hours into a cautionary tale. A punchline, a legendary, and a deeply, deeply foolish footnote in the history of our company, _____, the summons our CEO, Sam. The brilliant, chaotic, and deeply, deeply hoodie-loving man who had started this company with me in a garage 25 years ago had been on a much-needed 2-week off-the-grid fishing vacation in Alaska. He returned 3 days after my armored protest to a company that was, by all accounts, happier, more productive, and more deeply, deeply loyal than it had been in months. He also returned to an inbox containing approximately 5,237 emails, all with some variation of the subject line. You are not going to believe what Evie did. I had, of course, retired the suit of armor. Its purpose was served, but I had not taken it home. At the unanimous and the deeply passionate request of my colleagues, the suit was now a permanent installation. It was standing on its mannequin, in a place of honor in the corner of my cubicle, its polished steel gaze a silent and a deeply, deeply intimidating warning to any and all future incursions of pointless corporate bureaucracy. Sam walked onto the development floor that morning, a large and a deeply confused salmon in a cooler in one hand, his face a mask of profound and of a deeply, deeply bewildered jet lag. He saw his entire 200-person staff, all of them to a man and a woman wearing a hoodie. It was a silent and a deeply, deeply unified act of sartorial solidarity. And then he saw it. The full and the deeply, deeply shiny suit of 15th century Gothic plate armor. Standing guard over my desk, he had just stopped, and he had stared, and then he had looked at me. And a slow and a deeply, deeply familiar and a wonderfully, wonderfully weary smile had spread across his face. An hour later, I was summoned to his office. A separate and a much more formal summons was sent to Chadwick. The final and the most important battle of the war was about to begin. Underscore. Underscore the verdict. We sat in Sam's office, a comfortable and a deeply, deeply cluttered space that was the exact opposite of Chadwick's. Sterile glass box. There were old framed posters of our first and our deeply, deeply ugliest games on the walls. There was a half-finished 1,000-piece puzzle of a dragon on his coffee table. Chadwick, who looked like he had not slept in 3 days, was sitting in a chair opposite the desk, his hands clasped. His face a pale and a deeply, deeply miserable mask of a man who knew he was about to be fired. I sat next to him. Sam was not angry. He was, in his own strange and his deeply, deeply chaotic way, a scientist. And he was studying the results of a failed and a deeply, deeply fascinating social experiment. Chadwick, he began, his voice a low and a tired and a deeply, deeply final thing. I have a question for you. What, in your professional opinion, is our company's most valuable asset? Chadwick, seeing a chance to redeem himself with his beloved corporate jargon, sat up straight. Our most valuable asset, Sam, he began, his voice a reedy and a deeply, deeply unconfident thing, is our intellectual property, our brand, our position in the marketplace. Sam just looked at him, a look of profound and of a deeply, deeply sad pity on his face. Wrong, he said. He pointed a finger at me. She is our most valuable asset. She and the 199 other brilliant, difficult, and deeply, deeply eccentric human beings who work here. Our most valuable asset is not our property. It is our people and their creativity. He leaned forward. And your job, your one, and your only job as an HR manager was to protect that asset. It was to foster a culture where our people are brilliant and are deeply strange people could do the best and the most creative work of their lives. And you, in the space of 6 months, have done everything in your power to destroy that culture. You have, with your pointless and your deeply, deeply insulting policies, managed to do the one thing our biggest and our most well-funded competitors have never been able to do. You have managed to piss off Dr. Evelyn Reed. He turned to me and you, Evie, he said, a slow and a deeply, deeply amused grin spreading across his face. A suit of armor? Really? Suit of armor? It was formal business attire, I said, my own face a perfect and a deeply, deeply innocent mask. It did not have a hood. Sam just lost it then. He threw his head back and he laughed, a deep and a booming and a wonderfully, beautifully cathartic laugh that seemed to shake the entire room. He laughed until tears were streaming down his face when he had finally recovered. He took a deep breath and he became the CEO again. Okay, he said. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. This is a company-wide email, which I am sending in 5 minutes. He began to read to all Gravity Spike employees, from Sam, your long-suffering CEO. Subject, dress codes, common sense, and medieval weaponry. Hi, everyone. As many of you are aware, a new professional attire policy was implemented. While I was on vacation, I've now had the chance to review this policy and to witness its creative interpretations. And I have come to a simple and an immediate conclusion. It is a stupid, a pointless, and a deeply, deeply morale-killing policy, and it is hereby and with my most sincere apologies rescinded, effective immediately. Please feel free to wear your hoodies, your t-shirts, your sandals, or if you are Dr. Evelyn Reed, your full and your apparently battle-ready suit of 15th century Gothic plate armor to work whenever you damn well please. In other news, our HR manager, Chadwick, will be leaving us. He is being reassigned to a new and a more suitable role in our parent company's corporate headquarters in a city far, far away, where I am told his unique and his deeply, deeply enthusiastic passion for bureaucratic procedures will be a much better fit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a fish to cook. and a company culture to restore. Thank you." He put the letter down. He looked at Chadwick, whose face was now a pale and a deeply, deeply satisfying shade of gray. "I believe Sam said that you have some packing to do. Underscore, and that was it." The war was over. The tyrant was deposed and the kingdom was safe. I am sitting at my desk now, my favorite old and deeply, deeply comfortable MIT hoodie pulled over my head. The suit of armor is standing in the corner of my cubicle, a silent and a deeply, deeply shiny guardian of our company's soul. And my colleagues, my brilliant and my wonderful, and my deeply, deeply strange tribe of fellow nerds are back to doing what they do best, creating beautiful and deeply, deeply magical worlds. My revenge was a silly and a deeply, deeply absurd one. But it was also, in its own strange way, a profound act of loyalty. I had not just defended my right to be comfortable, I had defended the very idea of our company. And that was a victory that was sweeter and more satisfying than what? Like, look at this. And what? Look at this. And we all know I've been exploring that. We had most exalies, and we all know I've been exploring that path. I had not just defended my right. We had be cord till we make a pallet. I had defended the best of them. I have no skessive segordy, which for what I see, we be at word, we see, I see, we see, oncord, we see, kai to see, kai, can you to see, to lie, we see, you to get to we, you could kiss me, I'd or I'd, side of you could you with I any game we had ever created. The armor claws the year that followed my glorious and my deeply, deeply satisfying armored protest became known in the quiet, nerdy annals of our company's history as the Great Thawing. The brief and the deeply unpleasant ice age of Chadwick's tenure had been brought to an abrupt and a deeply hilarious end, and in its wake, the old and the wonderfully, beautifully chaotic culture of gravity spike games had begun to bloom again. The Nerf gun wars returned. The Dungeons and Dragons campaign was resurrected. And the entire 200-person staff, as a quiet and a deeply unified act of sartorial rebellion, wore a hoodie to work every single day for a month. It was a beautiful and a deeply, deeply comfortable sight. My suit of armor, which my son had reluctantly allowed me to keep on a long-term loan, was now a permanent and a deeply beloved fixture in my cubicle. It had become a company landmark. New hires on their first day tour of the office would be brought to my desk. And the tour guide would say, with a reverent and a deeply serious tone, and this is the armor of compliance. It is a monument to the soul of our company. Do you have any questions? The story had, as I had known it would, become a legend. It was our founding myth, our genesis story for the new post-Chadwick era. And it had, to my own quiet amusement, become a surprisingly effective recruiting tool. The best, the brightest, and the most fiercely independent minds in the video game industry, the ones who had been burned and who had been bored by the sterile and the soulless corporate culture of our larger competitors, they all wanted to come and work at the Suit of Armor Company. Our resumes inbox was overflowing. My ridiculous and my deeply, deeply petty act of malicious compliance had, in the end, been the greatest marketing campaign in our company's history. Underscore a new guardian, the only lingering. And the deeply unsettling question was the no vacant position of HR manager. For 6 months, the role had remained empty, a radioactive wasteland that no one, not even my old friend and CEO Sam, had dared to touch. But we were now a company of over 200 people, We needed an HR department. We needed someone to handle the boring, but the deeply, deeply necessary paperwork of our lives. The search for the new HR manager was a long and a deeply, deeply cautious one. And when the list of candidates had been narrowed down to a final 3, Sam had come. To my desk, Evie, he'd said, his voice a low and a deeply, deeply serious thing. I need your help. I need your eyes. You are the spiritual guardian of this place. I need you to sit in on the final interviews. I need you to help me pick the right person. The one who, won't make you feel the need to come. To work dressed as a 15th century warlord. Squiat agreed that the interviews were held in the main boardroom. I sat next to Sam, a quiet 16-9-year-old woman in a comfortable and a deeply, deeply non-compliant mid-hoodie. The first 2 candidates were both in their own special ways a disaster. They were Chadwick 2.0, young, slick, and deeply fluent in the meaningless and the deeply, deeply infuriating language of corporate buzzwords. Then, the final candidate had walked in. Her name was Anya Sharma. She was a woman in her 40s with a warm, intelligent smile and a background not in corporate HR, but in arts administration. She had been the head of HR for a major and a deeply chaotic Seattle-based theater company for the past 10 years. She had, I was quite sure, seen it all. At the end of the interview, after she had answered all of Sam's questions with a calm and a deeply, deeply sensible intelligence, I had asked my one and my only question. Anya, I'd said, my voice a quiet and a deeply, deeply serious thing. Are you familiar with the story of the suit of armor? A slow and a wonderfully, beautifully knowing smile had spread across her face. Of course, she'd said, it's the reason I applied for this job. She had looked at me, and her eyes were shining with a genuine and a deeply, deeply appreciative amusement. I think, she'd said, her voice a low and a confidential thing, that it was the most brilliant and the most effective piece of internal communications I have ever witnessed in my entire career. It tells me that this is a company that understands that its people are not just assets, but are creative and passionate, and sometimes deeply, deeply weird human beings. It tells me that this is a company that is willing to listen to its own internal feedback, even when that feedback is delivered in 60 pounds of articulated German steel. And that, she'd finished, a wide and a beautiful grin on her face, is the kind of company I want to work for. Sam and I had exchanged a look, and in that moment we had both known. We had found our new guardian. The armor Anya started the following month, and her first official act as our new and our deeply, deeply beloved head of human resources was to draft a new and a final addition to the company's official handbook. She had, of course, consulted with me on the wording. It was a single and a deeply, deeply beautiful clause added to the section on our corporate culture. It is now known and celebrated within the company as the Armor Clause. It reads, in its entirety, Gravity Spike Games is a company that is built on a foundation of creativity, a passion, and of a deep and a mutual respect for the brilliant and the often eccentric individuals who make our work possible. All corporate policies shall be implemented with a spirit of flexibility, common sense, and of a profound and an unwavering respect for our unique and our deeply, deeply cherished developer-first culture. And then, in a smaller and a deeply, deeply wonderful font, a final sentence, also, Dr. Evelyn Reed is allowed to do whatever the hell she wants. The legacy. I am sitting at my desk now. It is a Tuesday afternoon. The studio is a quiet and a deeply, deeply productive hum of creative energy. Anya is a magnificent HR manager. Our new game, Starfall Odyssey, is on track to be the biggest and the most successful launch in our company's history. And in the corner of my cubicle, a silent and a deeply, deeply shiny sentinel stands guard. My revenge on Chadwick. A small and a petty and A deeply, deeply silly man was never really about him. It was about the idea of him. The idea that a person's worth can be measured by the clothes they wear. The idea that a company's culture is a thing that can be dictated in a memo. The idea that rules for the sake of rules are more important than the people they are meant to serve. My ridiculous and my deeply, deeply theatrical act of malicious compliance had been a protest against that idea, and it had, in its own strange and deeply, deeply satisfying way, been a success. I had not just saved my right to wear a hoodie. I had, in a way, saved the very soul of the company I had spent my life building. A new hire, a young, and a brilliant. And a deeply, deeply nervous-looking programmer walks past my desk. He looks at the suit of armor, and his eyes go wide with a look of pure and of a deeply, deeply nerdy reverence. He then looks at me, and he gives me a small and a shy and a deeply, deeply respectful nod. I just smile and I nod back. Then I turn back to my screen. I have a world to build. And I am at long last, and with a deep and a profound and a deeply, deeply satisfying sense of peace, perfectly and completely and utterly dressed for the occasion. I spent the rest of the day practicing. I practiced walking without sounding like a falling chandelier. I practiced sitting. I practiced typing. And I practiced the single most important and the most deeply, deeply satisfying motion of all. The slow and the deeply, deeply intimidating lowering of my helmet's visor. By the end of the day, I was ready. The armor was polished. The stylus was secured. The plan was in place. I stood in my living room, the fully assembled suit of armor, standing on its mannequin in the corner like a silent steel ghost, a promise of the beautiful and the deeply, deeply chaotic day that was to come. Chadwick wanted me to be professional. He wanted me to adhere to the dress code. And I was going to give him more professionalism, more history, and more pure, unadulterated, and beautifully, wonderfully weaponized compliance than he had ever, in his wildest and his most deeply, deeply bureaucratic dreams, ever imagined. The commute Monday morning arrived not with its usual dreaded sense of weary obligation, but with the bright, thrilling, and slightly unhinged energy of a battle about to be joined. I woke up at 5 a.m. My usual routine of a quiet cup of coffee and a review of the weekend's code commits was not on the agenda. Today's agenda was significantly more medieval. Getting into 60 pounds of articulated 18-gauge steel is not a task one can rush. It is a process, a ritual. It is, I've discovered, a fantastic core workout. I laid the pieces of my son's magnificent Gothic plate armor out on a clean blanket on my garage floor, like a surgeon preparing his instruments. The greaves for my shins, the cuirass for my torso, the gauntlets for my hands. One by one, with a series of grunts and a great deal of quiet, and of deeply, deeply satisfying cursing of Chadwick's name, I strapped and I buckled and I cinched myself in. By the time I was finished, I was a 68-year-old 5 foot 4 inch and a deeply, deeply formidable killing machine. Or at least a woman who would make a great deal of noise. She were to fall down the stairs. The drive to work was an adventure in its own right. Getting into my sensible and my deeply, deeply practical Subaru was the first challenge. The cuirass, with its rigid backplate, did not allow for the natural human act of bending at the waist. I was forced to sort of fall into the driver's seat, a process that was neither graceful nor quiet. The commute on the I-5 into Seattle is always a grim and a deeply, deeply soul-crushing experience. But on this particular Monday, it was a parade. I was a strange and a deeply, deeply shiny new tourist attraction. I could feel the eyes of the other commuters on me. I saw a man in a pickup truck next to me do a spit take with his coffee. I saw a woman in a minivan, her car full of screaming children, just stare at me, her mouth agape as her children pointed at me with a kind of wild and of a deeply, deeply reverent joy. I was, for them, the most interesting thing that had happened on their commute in years. Just stared straight ahead. My gauntlet and my stylus-equipped hands held firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. And I drove the arrival, the parking garage. At our office building was the first real test of my new and my deeply, deeply inflexible lifestyle. The walk from my parking spot to the elevator was a symphony of echoing metallic clangs and scrapes. The security guard in the lobby, a lovely man named Barry, who I had known for 10 years, just stared at me, his eyes wide with a look of profound and of a deeply, deeply worried confusion. "Dr. Reed?" he'd whispered as I had clanked towards the security turnstiles. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine, Barry," I had said, my voice a muffled and a deeply, deeply intimidating echo from within my salad helmet. "I am just adhering to the new corporate dress code." The elevator ride to the 27th floor was a masterpiece of social awkwardness. I shared it with 3 terrified-looking junior executives from the accounting firm on the floor below us. They had pressed themselves into the far corner of the elevator, their eyes wide, a silent and a deeply, deeply respectful 3-foot perimeter between us. We had ridden up in a complete and a deeply, deeply uncomfortable silence. And then the moment had arrived. The elevator doors had opened. I had strode, with a slow and a deeply, deeply resonant clang-scrape-clang, out into the reception area of Gravity Spike Games. The receptionist, a young punk rock girl with a nose ring and a deep and an abiding hatred for all things corporate, had looked up, her eyes had widened, her jaw had dropped. And then a slow and a deeply, deeply appreciative grin had spread across her face. She had known instantly what was happening. She had just given me a slow and a deeply, deeply respectful nod and had pressed the button to unlock the main studio doors. I had pushed the doors open, and I had walked into my office. The effect was instantaneous. And it was glorious. It's the usual, chaotic and a deeply, deeply productive hum of the development floor just stopped. A wave of profound and of a deeply, deeply confused silence had washed over the entire open-plan office. 150 of the most brilliant and the most cynical nerds on the West Coast had slowly, one by one, looked up from their screens. And they had stared. I had just stood there for a moment in the center of the room, silent and a deeply, deeply shiny monument to a poorly written HR policy. And then the silence had been broken. It was not a laugh. It was a single end. A deeply, deeply appreciative snort from Marcus, the lead systems engineer. And that one small sound had broken the dam. The entire room had erupted, not in a loud and a disrespectful cheer, but in a wave of silent, and of a deeply, deeply hysterical, and of tears streaming down their faces. Laughter. Programmers were hiding their faces in their hands, their shoulders shaking. Artists were silently weeping into their sketch pads. It was the most beautiful and the most deeply, deeply satisfying sound I had ever heard. I had just given them a slight and a deeply, deeply regal nod. And then I had clanked with a slow and a deeply, deeply purposeful stride to my corner desk. Underscore the confrontation I spent the next hour working. It was a slow and a deeply, deeply inefficient process. I would peck at my keyboard with my stylus-equipped gauntleted finger, a single deliberate keystroke at a time. I would sip my coffee through the long and the deeply, deeply necessary straw I had brought from home. I had in the space of an hour managed to write 3.5 lines of code. But I was, without a doubt, the most formally attired person in the entire goddamn building. The news of my arrival had, of course, spread through the company's Slack channels like a wildfire. And it had eventually reached the small and the deeply, deeply humorless office of our new HR manager, Chadwick, arrived at my desk at 10:15 a.m. He was, as always, a vision of misplaced and of a deeply Eliso-Downquist corporate authority. He was flanked by the two deeply unfortunate junior HR assistants he had recently hired. He looked like a small, angry king with his two terrified and deeply, deeply unhelpful court jesters. He stood before my desk, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, his brain clearly and loudly short-circuiting at the sight of a 68-year-old woman in a full and a deeply, deeply shiny suit of medieval armor, slowly and methodically debugging a piece of code. "Dr. Reed," he finally sputtered, his voice a high and a deeply, deeply strangled squeak. What in God's name are you wearing?" I slowly and with a great and a deeply, deeply satisfying metallic scrape turned my helmeted head to look at him. I did not lift my visor. "Good morning, Chadwick," I said, my voice a muffled and a deeply, deeply intimidating echo. "I am wearing my clothes." "Fete," he said, his voice now arising and a deeply, deeply hysterical shriek, "is not a form of approved professional attire, is it not?" I asked, my voice a perfect and a deeply, deeply innocent question. "I have read your new policy meticulously, and I do not see it on the list of prohibited items. It is not a t-shirt, is not a sandal. And it is most certainly," I said, my voice a low and a deeply, deeply final thing, "not a hoodie." I slowly and with a great and a deeply, deeply theatrical effort, lifted my visor. I looked him in the eye. "The policy, Chadwick, as you yourself have written it, states that business casual or formal business attire. It's acceptable now," I said, my voice a calm and a deeply, deeply reasonable thing is this. "Business casual." I gestured to my own magnificent and my deeply, deeply shiny steel body.